My son's wife screamed at my birthday dinner, "You're a burden. You have nothing and never had." My son nodded in agreement, betraying me in my own home. I smiled quietly and called my business partner, knowing the truth they'd forgotten. I signed every one of his paychecks. They'd soon face the consequences of underestimating a 68-year-old man who built everything they took for granted. Before continuing, subscribe to our new channel, where we tell stories about men who take revenge on their insolent children, sons-in-law, and daughters-in-law. My name is Raymond Cole. I'm 68 years old, and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. I founded a small commercial construction company called Cole and Hartwell Construction LLC back in 2011. We build office spaces, small commercial properties, projects under $3 million. Nothing flashy, just solid work, done right, delivered on time. I'm not a loud man, never have been. I speak when I have something to say, and I stay quiet when I don't. Some people mistake that for weakness. That's usually their first mistake. I have two hobbies. In my garage, I build furniture, tables, chairs, bookshelves, out of reclaimed wood. Slow work, satisfying work. You take something rough and forgotten, and you shape it into something that lasts. I also collect antique pocket watches. Elgin, Waltham, Hamilton. Mechanical things from another era, precision built into every gear. I like that about them. They keep perfect time long after everyone who made them is gone. I tell you this because you need to understand who I am before I tell you what happened. I'm not a man who acts on impulse. I don't yell. I don't threaten. When something needs to be done, I make a plan. I check the details twice, and then I act. The people in this story forgot that about me. Or maybe they never knew it in the first place. My son Chris is 39. He's been the project manager at Cole and Hartwell for 6 years. I gave him that job. I want to be precise about that. He didn't interview for it, didn't earn it through years of demonstrated skill. He asked, and I said yes, because he was my son, and I believed in him. His salary is $6,800 a month. I signed every one of those checks. He married Vanessa 4 years ago. She's 36, sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, and has the particular talent of making you feel like she's doing you a favor by being in the same room with you. She doesn't work. She manages what she calls her personal brand on Instagram. 4,200 followers, mostly brunch photos and captions about protecting your energy. She once described a podcast episode about releasing toxic relationships to me over dinner, looking directly at me the entire time. I ate my food and said nothing. They moved into my house on Birchwood Drive 4 years ago. Temporary, Chris said. Just until we get on our feet. My house is 1,850 square feet on a quiet street. I paid off the mortgage in 2019. There is no lease. There was never a lease. They are guests, though in recent years they've come to act more like management. Chris wasn't always like this. I remember when he was 12 years old, he used to come out to the garage and watch me work. He'd sit on an overturned bucket and ask questions. How do you know which wood to use? How do you make the joints tight? How do you know when something's done? Good questions. I liked answering them. He had his mother's curiosity back then, and somewhere along the way he lost it, traded it for a golf membership and a habit of nodding whenever Vanessa spoke. I don't know exactly when the shift happened. I've thought about it. Maybe it was gradual. Maybe it was the day Vanessa first referred to my garage as that shed situation. Maybe it was when Chris stopped asking questions and started making assumptions. Assumptions about the company, about the house, about me. For the past 2 years, the pattern in that house has been consistent. Vanessa speaks. Chris either agrees or stays quiet. I occupy what feels increasingly like a guest room in my own home, tolerated, worked around, occasionally addressed when something needs fixing or a bill needs to be covered. I covered a lot of bills. I never kept count, which I understand now was a mistake. The birthday dinner was Chris's idea. A home-cooked dinner, just the three of us. On the evening of my 68th birthday, I sat down at my own kitchen table with a glass of sweet tea and a plate of food Vanessa had ordered from a catering service. I noticed the paper bags folded on the counter. Not home-cooked then. I said nothing. We ate. I asked Chris about the Hendricks Avenue build. A 2-story office space we'd been developing for 4 months. He gave me a vague answer, the kind you give someone you think won't understand the details. I'd been building things since before he could drive. I let it pass. Then Vanessa put down her fork. She did it deliberately. That particular motion, the slow, deliberate placement of silverware, it's a signal. I've seen it before. It means she's about to say something she's been holding for a while. "Raymond," she said. "Not Dad. Never Dad. I think we need to have an honest conversation." I looked at her. I didn't say anything. "You're a burden," she said. "I know that's a hard thing to hear, but someone has to say it. You have nothing. You never had anything. You sit in that garage playing with wood scraps while we're out here actually keeping things running. Chris manages the company. I manage this household. And you just exist here, taking up space." I looked at Chris. He looked at his plate. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Not a strong nod, not a confident one. The nod of a man who wants something to be over but doesn't have the courage to stop it. The nod of someone who has been practicing that particular motion for a long time. I sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator hum. Then I picked up my napkin, wiped the corner of my mouth, set it down on the table, and smiled. Not a big smile. A small, specific smile. The kind that forms when something you suspected is finally confirmed. I pushed back my chair, stood up, and walked out of the kitchen. I heard Vanessa say something behind me. I didn't catch the words. I wasn't listening anymore. I walked down the hall to my bedroom, sat on the edge of my bed, and looked at my phone. On the nightstand beside me was a 1923 Elgin pocket watch I'd been restoring for 3 weeks. The movement was clean. The case needed work. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in 2 months. Steve Hartwell. I pressed call. Steve answered on the second ring. That's typical for him. He's 61, practical, doesn't waste time on pleasantries, when he can tell from the tone of a call that pleasantries aren't the point. "Ray," he said. "What's going on?" I told him. Not everything, just the broad shape of it. The dinner. What Vanessa said. The nod. There was a long pause on his end. Steve is not a man who fills silence with noise. That's one of the reasons we've worked well together since 2011. He lets things land before he responds. "Ray," he said finally, "you know this is your call to make." "I know," I said. "I've already made it. I just wanted you to know first." Another pause. "All right," he said. "You need anything from me tonight?" "Not tonight?" "Okay." A beat. "Happy birthday, by the way." I almost laughed. "Thanks, Steve." I sat in my bedroom for another hour after that. The house was quiet. I heard the television come on in the living room, Vanessa's voice carrying down the hall, then Chris saying something in a lower register. Normal evening sounds, as if nothing had happened, as if a woman hadn't just told the man who owned the house, the company, and the chair she was sitting in, that he was nothing. I thought about a night about 12 years ago. Chris had just graduated from community college, and I took him to a steakhouse on South Boulevard. He'd struggled with his coursework, changed his major twice, and I'd never once made him feel bad about it. That night, he ordered the rib-eye and told me he wanted to learn the construction business from the ground up. Start at the bottom, work his way up, really understand it. "I want to earn it," he said. "I don't want it handed to me." I felt proud of him when he said that. I thought I'd done something right. I wonder now when he forgot that conversation, or if he ever meant it at all. The next morning I got up early. I drank my coffee in the garage, standing beside a half-built side table I'd been working on for 3 weeks. Solid walnut, mortise, and tenon joints. Then I got in my truck and drove to 880 Industrial Park Boulevard, Suite 12, the office of Cole and Hartwell Construction. I hadn't been there in 3 months. I'd stepped back from day-to-day operations gradually over the past couple of years, consciously because I trusted the business was running. Chris was managing projects. The company had reliable contractors, a decent bookkeeper, repeat clients. I didn't need to be there every day, or so I thought. Sandra, our office administrator, looked up when I walked in and her expression shifted. She wasn't surprised to see me, and there was something she'd been wondering whether to say. I sat at the desk in the back office, my desk, and asked her to pull the expense reports from the last 9 months. She brought them in a manila folder, then went back to her station without asking questions. She's worked here 7 years. She knows how to read a room. I went through the reports carefully, line by line. The pattern wasn't hard to find once I was looking for it. Small transactions, $1,200 here for client entertainment, $890 there for office equipment, $340 for project site materials, on a date when no active project site was logged. None of them large enough to trigger a second look on their own. Each one signed off under Chris's authorization as project manager. Over 9 months, $14,340 in expenses with no corresponding approval from me, no documentation, no receipts attached to the records. Just line items and Chris's signature. I took out my phone and photographed every page, slowly, thoroughly. I put the folder back. I told Sandra she'd done good work. I didn't say what I'd found, and she didn't ask. I drove home, made a sandwich, and ate it in the garage while I sanded a section of the walnut tabletop. Then I thought about the partnership agreement. Cole and Hartwell was established in 2011. The operating agreement was clear. I hold 70% as managing member. Steve holds 30%. Managing member means operational authority, hiring, firing, financial decisions, contracts. All of it flows through me. Chris's employment was never connected to any ownership stake. He was hired as an employee, a well-compensated employee in a role created for him, at a salary I approved, but an employee, nothing else. I'd always assumed he knew that. I understood now, sitting in my garage, sawdust on my hands and 9 months of fraudulent expense reports on my phone, that he did not know that, or that Vanessa had convinced him otherwise. Those two things might amount to the same problem with very different solutions. I remembered Vanessa's exact words from the night before. We're out here actually keeping things running. We, not just Chris. As though 4 years of living in my house, driving my spare truck, and building an Instagram following from my kitchen table had translated into some kind of ownership. It hadn't. None of it had. I set down the sandpaper and looked at the walnut tabletop. The grain was coming through now that I'd gotten the surface smooth. Deep, warm, with a quiet complexity you only see when you've done the work to find it. Most people walk past walnut and see brown wood. You have to slow down to see what's actually there. I picked up my phone and opened the browser. I searched for corporate attorneys in Charlotte, North Carolina. LLC operating agreements. Employment law. I found a firm on South Tryon Street. Second result. Clean website. Specific practice areas listed clearly. Business law. LLC disputes. Employment contracts. I noted the number. The next morning I called and asked for an appointment at the earliest availability. The receptionist asked what the consultation concerned. I told her a partnership agreement, an employment termination, and a residential property matter. She scheduled me for the following week. I hung up, went out to the garage, and got back to work on the table. The joints needed fitting. Patient work. Careful work. The kind of work where you can't rush the process, because if you get the fit wrong at the beginning, nothing that comes after will sit level. I've always understood that. Some people need to be reminded. The law firm was on the 5th floor of a building on South Tryon Street, downtown Charlotte. Glass doors, a reception desk, chairs in the waiting area that cost more than most people's dining room sets. I wore my gray jacket and my good boots, not to impress anyone, but because a man walking into a room with a problem should look like he arrived on purpose. Daniel Watts came out to greet me himself, mid-50s, trim, careful eyes behind wire-framed glasses. We shook hands, and he led me to a corner office overlooking the street, books on shelves, 2 neat stacks of folders on the desk. I told him everything. I laid it out the same way I'd go over blueprints with a subcontractor. Organized, specific, no unnecessary commentary. The company, the operating agreement, Chris's employment, the 9 months of unauthorized expenses totaling $14,340. The house on Birchwood Drive, fully owned, mortgage paid off, no lease ever signed. Watts listened without interrupting. He was the kind of man who let you finish a sentence before he started forming a response. I respect that in anyone. When I was done, he opened the folder I'd brought, printed copies of the expense reports, the operating agreement, the employment contract, and spent several minutes reading, not skimming, reading. His finger moved down the page, stopped at certain lines, moved again. Your operating agreement is clear, he said finally. You are the managing member with 70% ownership. That means full operational authority, hiring, termination, financial authorization. Your son's employment contract identifies him as a project manager, salaried employee. There is no ownership stake, no equity provision, no succession language anywhere in this document. He paused. He has no claim to the company. None. I know, I said. The unauthorized expenses give you termination for cause under North Carolina employment law. That's a solid basis. Documented, recurring, signed under his name. He can challenge it, but with this paper trail, a challenge won't get far. I nodded. Then Watts set down the folder and folded his hands on the desk in a way that told me the next part was something he'd found on his own before I'd walked in. I did some preliminary research before your appointment, he said. Standard practice when a client mentions an LLC in a family dispute. I ran a search of public legal consultation records. It's a limited database, voluntary filings from certain legal aid and referral services in the county. But it flagged something. He slid a printed page across to me. About 2 months ago, someone inquired at a legal aid referral office about whether a spouse of a minority LLC member could have marital property rights to that member's ownership interest. I looked at the page. The name on the inquiry record was Vanessa Cole. I read it twice. Then I set it down. She's not the spouse of a minority member, I said. No, Watts said. She's the spouse of a salaried employee with no ownership stake. The inquiry suggests she believed, or was told, something different. I sat with that for a moment. 2 months ago. That meant Vanessa had started looking into this before my birthday dinner, before the speech, before the nod. Whatever she said that night wasn't frustration boiling over. It was a test. She was checking whether I'd react, what I'd do, how much I understood about my own position. She thought she was playing chess. She hadn't noticed I was already sitting at the board. What do you need from me to move forward? I asked. A full document audit, Watts said. I review every agreement, every employment record, every property deed. That gives us a complete picture before we take any action. I want no surprises. He quoted me a flat fee. $3,500 for the audit, billed up front. I wrote him a check before I left. In the elevator on the way down, I thought about Vanessa's face at the birthday dinner, the deliberate placement of her fork, the tone she used, the tone of someone delivering a verdict, not starting an argument. She'd been preparing that moment, probably rehearsed it. I wondered how many times she'd practiced that speech. I wondered if she'd considered what I might do after. Apparently not. I drove back to Birchwood Drive, parked in the garage, and stood at my workbench for a while without touching anything. The walnut table was nearly done. One more session on the finish, and it would be ready. I ran my hand along the surface, smooth, solid, level on all 4 legs. 3 days later, Watts called. The audit was complete. Everything confirmed what we already knew, plus one addition, a provision buried in the original 2011 operating agreement, stating that any transfer of ownership interest required written consent from both partners. Steve and me, not Chris, not Vanessa, not anyone else. Before we act on the employment matter, Watts said, there's a sequencing question. The house and the company are separate issues legally, but they're connected practically. If you move on one and leave the other open, it creates leverage for them. Meaning, I said, though I already had a sense of where he was going. Meaning, he said, before you terminate his employment, you should know exactly where you stand on the property. We need to look at the house first. I thanked him, hung up, and stood in the garage for a long moment. Then I went inside and made dinner. Chris and Vanessa were in the living room. She was filming something for her Instagram, holding her phone at arm's length, speaking in the practiced upbeat tone she reserved for that particular audience. Chris was on the couch watching television. Nobody acknowledged me when I walked through. That was fine. I was used to being invisible in my own house. It had stopped bothering me around the same time I started understanding what that invisibility was actually worth. The Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds is in uptown Charlotte, on East Trade Street. A practical building, nothing remarkable about it. I'd been there once before, in 2019, when I filed the final paperwork after paying off the mortgage on Birchwood Drive. That was a good day. I remembered thinking, standing at the counter, that the house was fully mine for the first time. No bank, no monthly obligation, no condition attached to ownership. I went back the following week. The clerk pulled the deed record for 3114 Birchwood Drive without any difficulty. The document was exactly as I remembered it. My name, the legal description of the property, the recording date, no other names, no liens, no encumbrances. I asked for a certified copy. It cost me $14. I tucked it into my jacket pocket and drove back across town. The key question under North Carolina law, Watts had explained it clearly, was whether Chris and Vanessa had any legal basis to remain in the house once I gave them notice. For tenants with a lease, you follow one process. For occupants with no lease and no formal agreement, the law is different. Under NC General Statute 42-26, a property owner can require an unlawful occupant to vacate with written notice. 30 days, properly served. No lease meant no tenant rights. They were guests in a house that belonged to me, and guests can be asked to leave. There was one thing worth checking. Whether anything I'd said to Chris over the years could be interpreted as a promise, an agreement, or an informal understanding about the property. Watts asked me directly about this during our second meeting. Has there ever been any written communication, text, email, letter, in which you indicated the house was theirs, or that they had some claim to it? I thought about it carefully. I may have told him once, early on, that while they lived there, they should treat it like their home. Watts wrote something down. Approximate time? A couple of years in, he was talking about painting one of the rooms. I told him to go ahead, treat it like his own place. That's hospitality language, Watts said, not a property agreement. It doesn't create a tenancy, and it doesn't create a legal right to occupy. A court would not find an implied lease in that statement. He paused. I want you to be sure, though. Any other communications like that? I thought again. No. Then you're clean, he said. I hired a notary, a woman named Pamela Ashley, whose office was on Park Road, to prepare and certify the notice to vacate. The document was formal, specific, and unambiguous. Chris and Vanessa were required to vacate the premises at 3114 Birchwood Drive, no later than 30 days from the date of service. I had it prepared. I did not serve it yet. Timing mattered. Watts and I had discussed the sequence. Handle the employment termination first. Let the legal basis for that action be clean and documented. Then serve the notice. Doing both simultaneously could look retaliatory. Doing them in the right order made each action stand on its own merits. So I waited. I went home each evening, made my coffee, worked in the garage. The walnut table was finished. I'd started a new piece, a small cabinet, cherry wood with dovetail joints. Patient work. I was good at patient work. Vanessa, during this period, seemed to be operating on a low frequency of suspicion. One evening I heard her say to Chris, not quietly enough, "He's been going out a lot. Where does he even go?" Chris's response, muffled through the wall, "I don't know. Errands, probably." Errands, yes. The kind of errands that involve certified copies of property deeds, corporate attorneys on South Tryon Street, and notarized legal documents in a manila folder in my truck. I almost laughed at that one. The thing about Vanessa is that she's smart in a particular way. She reads people quickly, she identifies weaknesses efficiently, and she's very good at pressing those weaknesses at the right moment. What she's less good at is accounting for the possibility that the person she's assessed as weak has quietly been assessing her right back. She'd looked at me and seen a 68-year-old man who spent his evenings in a garage. Quiet, accommodating, slow to anger, not a threat. She wasn't entirely wrong about the observations. She was completely wrong about the conclusions. The following week I met with Watts again, this time with Steve on speakerphone from his office across town. We went through the termination process step by step. Under Chris's employment contract, termination for cause required written notice, documentation of the specific violations, and a final paycheck calculated according to NC wage and hour law. Watts had prepared the termination letter. Steve had reviewed it. The documentation, the 9 months of expense reports, the specific unauthorized line items, the totals, was attached as an exhibit. We set the date. I drove home that evening and sat in the garage for a while after dinner. The cherry cabinet was coming along. The dovetail joints were cut. Tight, clean. The kind of fit that doesn't need glue to hold because the geometry does the work. Through the door that connected the garage to the house, I could hear the television. Vanessa laughing at something. The low rhythm of the household going on exactly as it had for 4 years. Comfortable, untroubled, built entirely on a foundation that I had quietly, methodically begun to remove. They had no idea. And in 4 days, they were going to walk into a conference room and find out exactly who had been signing those paychecks all along. I arrived at 880 Industrial Park Boulevard at 8:47 in the morning. Steve Hartwell was already in the conference room when I walked in. Jacket on, coffee in front of him, the same steady expression he brings to every meeting where something serious is about to happen. Daniel Watts was beside him, a legal pad on the table and a manila folder to his left, the termination letter, the expense documentation, the final paycheck. Sandra had been told to hold calls until 10. I sat down. The 3 of us didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. We'd gone over every detail twice. Everything was in order. At 9:15, Chris walked through the door. He was wearing the blue Oxford shirt he saved for client meetings, the one that was supposed to signal competence. He had a coffee cup from the place 2 blocks down. He was 15 minutes late, which wasn't unusual, and he was carrying his phone in his hand the way people do when they're mid-conversation with someone. Vanessa, almost certainly. He looked at the 3 of us, and the relaxed expression on his face shifted. Not dramatically. Just a flicker. He sat down across from me and set his coffee on the table. "What's going on?" he said. I slid the first document across to him, the expense printout. 9 months, line by line. Every unauthorized charge with his signature beside it. The total at the bottom, $14,340. He looked at it. His eyes moved down the page slowly. I slid the second document across. The termination letter, effective that day for cause, citing the specific provision of his employment contract that addressed unauthorized financial expenditures. The third, a check for $2,100. Final paycheck, calculated precisely. His last 2 weeks of salary, minus the amounts legally withheld under the documented misuse provision. I let him read. I didn't say anything. That's a habit I've kept a long time. When you're presenting someone with facts, you let the facts do the initial work. Filling the silence before they've absorbed what's in front of them is a mistake. Chris set down the check. He looked up at me. His face had moved through confusion, recognition, and something close to calculation in the span of about 90 seconds. That last one told me he was already thinking about his next move, rather than the one he'd just walked into. "This is the family business," he said. "It's a limited liability company," I said. "Your employment was at will, subject to the terms of your contract. The contract is on page 2. Dad, your personal items can be removed from your office by 5 o'clock this afternoon. Sandra will arrange access." I paused. "Watts is here if you have questions about the legal specifics." Chris looked at Watts, who returned the measured look of a man with nothing personal against anyone at the table and complete confidence in the documents in front of him. Then Chris looked back at me. I could see something working behind his eyes, the familiar process of finding the version of events in which he was the wronged party. "What is Mom going to say about this?" he asked. It was an odd thing to say, and I think he knew it the moment it left his mouth. His mother has been gone for 11 years. I think he meant something else, some appeal to family feeling, some suggestion that a father shouldn't do this to a son. But the words he reached for were wrong, and they landed strangely in the room. I held his gaze. "Your position no longer exists, Chris," I said quietly. "You were a salaried manager. You always were. I suppose I forgot to remind you somewhere along the way." He sat there another few seconds. Then he stood, took the check, and walked out of the conference room without looking at Steve or Watts. I heard his footsteps cross the main office. Then the front door. Steve picked up his coffee. Went about how I expected. Yes, I said. Watts was already writing on his legal pad. I'll flag the file as active. If there's a response within the week, I want to be ready. There was a response within the week. 2, actually. 3 days later, a formal complaint filed with the NC Department of Labor alleging wrongful termination. The attorney on record was a man named Trevor Lang, whose firm was listed at an address off Albemarle Road. Watts pulled his bar registration, 6 years in practice, mostly personal injury and employment disputes. Not incompetent, not experienced with LLC employment structures. The documentation makes this untenable, Watts told me. They'd need to show the termination was retaliatory or lacked cause. 9 months of signed expense records and a clear contractual provision shuts that down. The second response came from Chris's social media accounts. I don't follow him, but Sandra mentioned it the next morning. Something about family betrayal and what happens when loyalty means nothing. Vague enough to deny, specific enough that anyone who knew the situation understood perfectly. I didn't respond. I went home, worked on the cherry cabinet for 2 hours, and went to bed. But I knew Vanessa well enough by then to know she was already planning the next move. She never stopped at one. She was 3 steps ahead in her mind, and she was going to make a mistake, because people who think 3 steps ahead, while underestimating their opponent, always do. I just needed to be patient a little longer. The following morning, Watts called. Their labor complaint is filed and assigned. We have 30 days to respond. A brief pause. But that's not what I wanted to tell you. There's something more interesting. Watts told me what he'd found in the public records. 2 days after the notice to vacate was prepared and notarized with Pamela Ashley, Vanessa had walked into a bank branch on Park Road. Specifically the branch where I kept a personal operating account I'd used for years to cover household expenses, utilities, groceries, minor repairs. Current balance, $18,000. The account was in my name only. Always had been. But Vanessa had apparently concluded that 4 years of living under my roof entitled her to a different interpretation. She attempted to withdraw $11,000. The bank froze the request immediately. The account required my authorized signature for any transaction. Her name appeared nowhere on the record. The teller escalated to a branch manager who documented the attempt and declined the transaction. I received a notification letter in the mail 3 days later, standard practice for attempted unauthorized account access. She tried to take $11,000 from your personal account, Watts said, with the tone of a man whose theory has just been confirmed. She did, I said, without authorization or legal standing. Correct. I'll note that in the file. It establishes a pattern of conduct, if this proceeds to court. I wasn't thinking about court right then. I was thinking about Vanessa standing at that teller window, the slight lift of her chin, the practiced confidence she carried into every room where she expected compliance. And then the moment the teller's expression shifted, and the slow realization that the transaction was not going to happen, I would have paid to watch that. 11 days after the complaint was filed, the NC Department of Labor sent its determination. The complaint was dismissed. The termination documentation, 9 months of signed expense records, clear contractual provisions, was sufficient to establish cause. No factual basis for proceeding. Watts forwarded me a copy that morning. I read it over coffee in the garage, next to the nearly finished cherry cabinet. That same afternoon, Lang called Watts with a second notice. His clients intended to file a civil action in Mecklenburg County Superior Court. 2 grounds: intentional infliction of emotional distress and breach of oral contract. The alleged oral contract being that I had, at some unspecified point, promised to transfer ownership of Cole and Hartwell to my son. I had made no such promise. I had never come close to making such a promise. The company had a written operating agreement, signed in 2011, with no succession language of any kind. I had once told Chris he'd have a place in the company as long as he earned it. That was not a contract. That was a sentence. Lang knows this is thin, Watts told me. A civil suit for oral contract breach on a business asset requires evidence of a clear promise, consideration, and demonstrated reliance. He has none of that. The emotional distress claim is weaker still. The conduct doesn't meet the threshold. So why file it? I asked. Leverage, Watts said. He's hoping you'll settle to avoid the process. Some people do. I understood the calculation. Some people, faced with a nuisance lawsuit from their own son, would weigh the settlement against the fight and decide the check was easier. That calculation assumed the person being sued cared primarily about convenience. I did not. Let them file, I said. 2 days later, a Tuesday evening, when I came home from a hardware run and found Vanessa filming an Instagram video in my kitchen, speaking in her practiced upbeat tone about knowing your worth, I went to the guest room, took the envelope from the dresser drawer, and walked back through the house. I set 2 envelopes on the kitchen table, one addressed to Chris, one to Vanessa. I didn't say anything. Vanessa lowered her phone and looked at the envelopes and then at me. I held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then I walked to the garage and closed the door. Inside each envelope, a notarized notice to vacate citing North Carolina, General Statute 42-26, prepared by Pamela Ashley. A certified copy of the recorded deed for 3114 Birchwood Drive. My name on that deed, clear as anything, and a deadline, 30 days from date of service. About 4 minutes later, through the garage wall, I heard Vanessa laugh. Not a nervous laugh, dismissive. The laugh that says he doesn't have the nerve. She was still running on the assumption that the quiet man who had spent 4 years accommodating everything in his own house was bluffing, that someone who had let her redecorate his living room and criticize him at his own birthday table was not serious about this piece of paper. She was wrong about that in the most complete way possible. Watts had already filed a precautionary motion with Mecklenburg County District Court. If they didn't vacate voluntarily by the stated date, the court process was already moving. We would not be starting from scratch. That evening, Lang called Watts. His clients were disputing the notice, he said. Chris also had information he believed was relevant to the civil suit. Watts called me after. Lang says they're not leaving, he said, and Vanessa has apparently been going through Chris's phone. She's looking for something. I was quiet for a moment. Let her look, I said. The evening I placed those envelopes on the kitchen table, I drove home from the hardware store with a bag of wood finish and a particular kind of calm I'd come to recognize over the past few weeks. Not the calm of someone who has given up, the calm of someone who has already done the difficult part and is now simply watching what comes next. I set the envelopes down in the center of the table, one beside the other, Chris's name on one, Vanessa's on the other. Then I went to the garage. I didn't wait to watch them open the letters. Either they would read the documents carefully and understand their situation, or they wouldn't. And in either case, the legal process was already moving regardless of their reaction. But I heard it anyway. About 4 minutes after I closed the garage door, Vanessa's voice came through the wall. Not words exactly. More of a short, sharp laugh, the kind that says, "This is ridiculous." Then her voice clearer, something about not being serious, something about him not having the nerve. Then quiet. Then Chris, lower, asking something I couldn't make out. Then Vanessa, on the phone, her tone shifting into the business-like register she reserved for professionals. Precise, stripped of casual contempt. She was calling Trevor Lang. I found that out the next morning when Watts called. Lang contacted my office at 8:45, he said. His clients are disputing the notice, claiming the eviction is retaliatory in connection with the employment termination. Is it? No, Watts said. The termination and the property matter are legally separate. The notice is properly served, properly notarized, and grounded in your ownership rights. There's no lease. There's no tenancy. There's nothing to dispute. He paused. I've already filed the precautionary motion with Mecklenburg County District Court. If they're not out by the deadline, we go straight to summary ejectment. That evening I came through the kitchen for coffee and found Chris sitting at the table, alone. Not eating, not on his phone, just sitting. He looked up when I walked in, and what I saw on his face was something I hadn't seen there in years. Not the low-grade dismissiveness he'd worn like a second skin, not the careful neutrality he maintained when Vanessa was in the room. Something more like a person trying to understand how he'd arrived at a particular place. "Dad," he said. I poured my coffee. "We can talk about this," he said. "There has to be something we can work out." I turned and looked at him. 39 years old, sitting at a table in a house that belonged to me, asking if we could talk about something he'd had 4 years to address without being prompted. "You had 4 years, Chris," I said. "The deadline is the 16th. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw tightened. Not anger exactly, more like a man swallowing something he'd rather say out loud. I took my coffee to the garage. The cherry cabinet stood in the corner, finished, catching morning light through the side window. 6 weeks from raw lumber to completed piece. Each stage done in the right order, measuring, cutting, fitting, sanding, finishing. You can't rush dovetail joints. You can't skip the prep work on the finish coat. You do it right, or you do it twice. I'd spent a lot of time in that garage over the past month, and I understood now that it hadn't just been about the cabinet. Working with your hands while your mind is occupied with something else has a way of keeping both things honest. The wood doesn't care about your problems. It responds to the work, or it doesn't. I stood at the workbench for a while, running a hand along the finished surface. Then I put my tools away and went inside. The next day, Lang filed a motion for emergency hearing with the county court. Watts called immediately. They're arguing the notice to vacate should be stayed pending resolution of the civil suit, claiming the two matters are connected. Can they get that? Unlikely. The standard for a stay is high, and the civil suit hasn't even been formally served yet. But the judge will hear it. A brief pause. Lang also mentioned that his clients have written communications they believe establish an informal tenancy. He didn't quote the text, but I suspect I know what it is. I thought back to what Watts had asked me weeks earlier. Any communications in which you indicated the house was theirs? And my honest answer, that once, a couple of years in, I told Chris to treat the place like his own. One sentence in a text thread about repainting a bathroom. "I know what she found," I said. "Handle the hearing," I told Watts. "It won't change anything." "It won't," he agreed. "But I'll address it directly rather than let them present it as something significant." That night, through the wall, I heard Vanessa on the phone. Not with Lang this time. The tone was different, more animated. She was telling a story. Her voice carried the particular inflection she used when she wanted the listener to understand, beyond any doubt, that she was the wronged party in the situation she was describing. I wondered who she was talking to. A friend, maybe. Someone from her Instagram world. Someone who knew only what she told them and would respond with the appropriate outrage. That was how she operated. She curated the version of events that served her, then presented it to an audience that had no reason to question it. It occurred to me that I'd been that audience for a long time. The person in the room who absorbed her version of things without pushback, who tolerated her framing because it seemed easier than correcting it. I understood now that my patience hadn't looked like grace to her. It had looked like permission. I sat in the garage until the sound stopped. Then I went inside, checked the back door, and went to bed. The court hearing was in 3 days. There was nothing to do but let it proceed. She found what she was looking for in Chris's message history. Lang referenced it at the emergency hearing, and this time he quoted it directly. 11 words, sent by me roughly 2 years earlier, in response to Chris asking whether it was all right to repaint the guest bathroom. "While you're living here, consider it your home." A hospitality statement, the kind you make when you don't want a house guest to feel like they're walking on eggshells. Not a lease, not a promise of continued occupancy, not an agreement of any kind under North Carolina law. Vanessa had carried those 11 words to Lang's office like she was delivering Exhibit A in a landmark case. Watts called me from the courthouse parking lot after the hearing. The judge reviewed the text message. Lang argued it established an implied tenancy. I responded that the message contained no duration, no rent amount, no terms of any kind, and that under North Carolina General Statute 42-1, an implied tenancy requires considerably more than a single informal statement. A pause. Motion denied. How did Lang take that? About how you'd expect. I drove home to a house that felt different. Not quieter, if anything louder in concentrated bursts. Cabinets opening and closing, the scrape of furniture being shifted. Vanessa had begun processing the reality of the situation in the only way available to her. She was moving things, asserting some form of control over the space she still occupied. That same afternoon, a neighbor 3 streets over, a woman named Carol I sometimes ran into at the hardware store, sent me a screenshot without comment. Vanessa's Instagram. The caption described, without naming anyone directly, a controlling older family member who had weaponized his assets against people who spoke truth to his face. She described being removed from her home by someone with deep psychological issues around power. She used the phrase elder manipulation twice. The post had gathered a respectable number of sympathetic comments from people who knew nothing about $14,340 in unauthorized expense reports, an attempted $11,000 bank withdrawal, or a civil suit that hadn't identified a single applicable statute. I looked at the screenshot for about 30 seconds. Then I forwarded it to Watts with one sentence. Please add this to the file. He responded within 10 minutes. Already noted. Defamation requires publication of false statements of fact. This qualifies. I'll document it formally. I wasn't planning to sue Vanessa for defamation. I had no appetite for that fight, but I wanted the record to reflect clearly what she was doing and when, so that if she ever tried to reframe this story in any form, there would be documentation that told a different one. That evening I called Steve Hartwell. We talked for 40 minutes, not about the eviction, which was on its own track, but about the company, about the civil suit and what it meant for Cole and Hartwell to carry that noise through the summer, about liability exposure and the practical cost of a frivolous claim sitting in a queue. There's a cleaner option, Steve said. We'd discussed restructuring before. The idea? Form a new operating entity. Transfer the active contracts and client relationships. Let Cole and Hartwell, LLC, stand as a shell. Any future claim against the old company would find nothing actionable. The new entity, Hartwell Cole Building Group, LLC, would carry everything forward, with the same ownership split. Me at 70%, Steve at 30%. I want it done right, I said. Watts can handle it. Clean filing, clean assignments. A pause. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I called Watts the next morning and authorized the restructuring. He quoted $4,200 for the entity formation and contract assignments. I approved it that day. While all of this moved in parallel, the eviction process, the defamation file, the restructuring, Lang's civil suit was technically still active. It had a case number. It was sitting in a queue with no hearing date assigned. And then, 2 days before the eviction deadline, Lang called Watts. His clients were prepared to vacate voluntarily and on time, he said, in exchange for a payment of $15,000. Watts called me with the offer. I sat with that number for a moment. $15,000. For leaving a house they had never paid a dollar to occupy, never signed a document to establish any right to, and had stayed in past the legal departure date. It was, I had to admit, a bold ask. What do you recommend? I asked Watts. Legally, you owe them nothing, he said. The labor complaint is dismissed. The civil suit has no viable ground. The eviction proceeds on schedule regardless. The $15,000 is a number chosen because it sounds like a reasonable settlement to someone who just wants this to end. And if I decline? They leave on the 16th anyway, under court order if necessary. Lang knows this. It's a last attempt to extract something from a situation that's already over for them. I thought about it. I'll make a counter, I said, but not with money. Watts and I met at his office on South Tryon the morning after Lang's call. He had the settlement proposal printed out and set on the table between us. $15,000, typed neatly in a formal letter, as though the number had some legal weight behind it. It didn't. They have no grounds, Watts said. The labor complaint was dismissed. The civil suit hasn't been assigned a hearing date and won't survive a motion to dismiss. Lang has no evidence of an oral contract that meets any legal standard. The eviction is proceeding on schedule. Their only leverage is inconvenience. I know, I said. I'm not paying them. Watts nodded once, unsurprised. Then we decline and proceed. I want to make a counter, I said. Not with money. With conditions. I'd been thinking about it since the night before, sitting in the garage with the 1923 Elgin movement spread across a clean cloth on the workbench. The Elgin was a pocket watch I'd had for 3 years, a railroad-grade movement in a cracked case, which I'd sourced a replacement for and was in the process of fitting. The gears were clean, the mainsprings sound. It was going to keep excellent time once I closed it up and set it running again. I'd been thinking about the watch, and I'd been thinking about what I actually wanted from the end of this. I didn't want their money. I didn't need an apology. What I wanted was a clean line, a document that made it impossible for either of them to come back in 6 months with some new version of the claim that I owed them something. Here's what I'll offer, I told Watts. $0 cash, but I'll cover up to $1,200 toward their first month's rent on a new place, paid directly to the landlord, not to them, and I'll cover the cost of a moving truck, booked through a company of my choosing, one way. In exchange, Chris signs a mutual release agreement releasing all claims against me and against Cole and Hartwell Construction, past and present. Vanessa removes the Instagram post that Watts has already flagged, and they're out of the house by the stated deadline. No extensions. Watts wrote it all down. That's a reasonable counter, he said. Generous, actually, given the circumstances. It's not generous, I said. It's efficient. I want this finished. He sent the counter to Lang that afternoon. Lang called back within 2 hours. His clients, he said, needed to discuss it. Watts told him they had until the following morning. I drove home. The house on Birchwood Drive was quiet when I got there, quieter than it had been in weeks. Chris's car was in the driveway, but there was no sound from inside. I went to the garage, sat down at the workbench, and picked up the Elgin case. The replacement case had arrived the week before. Same era, same dimensions, sourced from a watch parts dealer in Ohio. I'd been cleaning it, checking the fit. The movement seated well, the crown wound smoothly. I set the hands to the correct time using the clock on the wall, closed the case, and held the watch for a moment. It ticked. The next morning, Watts called at 8:15. Lang's clients had agreed to the counter. Chris would sign the mutual release agreement. Vanessa would remove the Instagram post. They would vacate by the stated deadline. In exchange, I would arrange and pay for 1 month's rent credit of up to $1,200 and 1 moving truck. Get the release signed before the moving date, I told Watts. Not after. Already planned, he said. The release was signed 3 days later in Lang's office, with both attorneys present. Watts sent me a copy that afternoon. I read through it once, confirmed every clause, and filed it in the folder with everything else. The moving truck was a company Watts's office used for client relocations. Eastside Movers, clean operation, flat rate booking. I called and arranged the pickup myself. 1 truck, 1 day, 1 address. I paid $380 up front by card. The final day came on a Tuesday. I was in the garage when they started loading. I could hear the front door opening and closing, the thud of boxes, the particular rhythm of people moving through a house they are leaving rather than living in. I didn't go inside. I didn't supervise. There was nothing to supervise. The agreement was signed. The truck was booked. The deadline was the deadline. Around mid-morning, the sound changed. Quieter. Then the truck engine. Then Chris appeared in the garage doorway. He stood there for a moment without saying anything. He looked different than he had in the conference room the morning I terminated his employment. Less guarded, less careful. Something had moved in him since that day, and I didn't know exactly what it was or what it would eventually become. "You could have just talked to me?" he said. I set down the Elgin and looked at him. He was my son. I'd known him his whole life. I remembered him at 12, sitting on an overturned bucket in this same garage, asking questions about wood and joinery that showed a mind I'd once been proud of. "I talked for 4 years, Chris," I said. "You were listening to someone else." He stood there another moment. Then he walked back through the house to the truck. A few minutes later, the engine sound moved down the street and faded. I sat in the garage for a while after that. The house was very quiet. It hadn't been that quiet in a long time. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds. It was a routine notification, the kind sent automatically when a records inquiry is made on a registered property. Someone had searched the deed record for 3114 Birchwood Drive. The name on the inquiry, Vanessa Cole. I called Watts. Public record search, he said. Anyone can do it. She's not contesting the deed or filing anything. She's looking. Looking for what? Something that isn't there, he said simply. I'll add the notification to the file. That was the last action Vanessa took that required any response from me. The file stayed open for another 5 weeks, and nothing came through it. The civil suit, the oral contract claim, the emotional distress claim, the entire constructed case that Lang had filed with such confidence, was officially withdrawn about 6 weeks after the move-out. Watts received the notice on a Wednesday afternoon and forwarded it to me without comment, other than a single line, as expected. File closed on our end unless you'd like to retain it. I told him to retain it for 1 year, then discard. The reason for the withdrawal was simple and, in its own way, satisfying. Lang had asked Chris for a retainer to continue. $4,000, standard for the stage the case was approaching. Chris didn't have $4,000. He'd been living on his last paycheck from Cole and Hartwell, the $2,100 I'd issued at termination, plus whatever he and Vanessa had scraped together from their savings. Without my salary, without my house, without the structure I'd provided for 4 years, the architecture of their life turned out to be considerably thinner than they'd understood. I didn't feel triumph about that specifically. I felt something more like recognition. This was what had always been underneath. Not capability, not self-sufficiency, but the assumption that the foundation would always hold because it always had. Cole and Hartwell. Construction LLC completed its restructuring in the weeks after the move-out. Watts handled the entity formation for Hartwell Cole Building, Group LLC, filing the articles with the NC Secretary of State. The operating agreement mirrored the original, me at 70% as managing member, Steve at 30%. Active contracts assigned to the new entity. The old LLC retained as a dormant shell for 2 years, per Watts's recommendation. Steve called the day the filing was confirmed. Clean slate, he said. That was the point, I told him. One afternoon in late summer, about 2 months after the move-out, I was in the garage when I heard a notification on my phone. I set down the sandpaper I'd been using on the new piece, a small side table in white oak, simple design, straight legs, and picked it up. A message from Chris. 2 words, I'm sorry. I read it once. I set the phone face down on the workbench and picked up the sandpaper. I didn't respond that day, not because I had nothing to say and not because I was punishing him. I didn't respond because I hadn't yet decided what I wanted the response to be, and I wasn't going to send something I hadn't thought through. That's how I'd operated my whole life with matters that counted, and I saw no reason to change it now. The Elgin pocket watch was finished. It sat on the shelf above the workbench in its replacement case, running steadily. A 1923 movement, over 100 years old, restored to accurate time by someone who didn't rush it. There's a particular quality to a house when it's fully yours again, not just owned on paper, truly yours. You move through the rooms at your own pace without adjusting to anyone else's presence or schedule. I'd lived here for over 20 years, paid for every inch of it, and watched it become someone else's territory without noticing when the shift happened. Now it was mine again. The guest room floor, I decided, needed replacing. The carpet had been worn down by 4 years of other people's use, and I'd never liked carpet in that room to begin with. I ordered 700 square feet of red oak flooring, $1,140 delivered, and spent a weekend laying it myself. It was straightforward work. I'd done hardwood floors before. The room came out level and clean, with a warm grain that caught the afternoon light well. The following week I received a call from a property in Concord, a small city about 20 miles northeast of Charlotte, inquiring about commercial construction estimates. A 2-story professional building, approximately 8,400 square feet. The kind of project Hartwell Coal Building Group was positioned to handle cleanly. I called Steve and told him to put together a bid. As for Vanessa, the Florida judgment she'd carried since 2021, the $4,700 in unpaid debt plus accumulated interest, found its way to a collections agency operating out of Raleigh during that summer. They'd located her new Charlotte address through standard skip tracing. The document had always been public record. I'd noted it months ago, kept it in the file, and never used it. I hadn't needed to. Some things resolve themselves when people stop being insulated from their own history. I didn't know the outcome of that particular situation. I didn't look into it. It wasn't my concern. Late one evening in August, I was at the workbench finishing the surface on the white oak table. The Elgin ticked steadily on the shelf above me. The garage smelled of sawdust and finish oil, the way it always had. The way it had when Chris was 12 years old, sitting on a bucket, asking me how you know when something is done. You know when it sits level, I told him. You know when the surface is smooth. You know when it holds. I held up the table and checked it. Level on all four legs. Surface smooth. It would hold. I turned off the workbench light, locked the garage, and went inside. If you like this story, subscribe to our new channel and listen to a few stories there. You can find the link to it in the collaboration or description of this video or in the comments. Subscribe so you don't lose us, because this channel may soon cease to exist.